Well, I mean, honestly, Andrew, you and I sitting next to each other is really sort of a joke. So, this is the Peter and Paul night for any of you who, are feeling like New Testament. Because we have Peter Ash and we have Paul McGrath, and they're similar kinds of guys in lots of ways. Both of them men looking for a mission, right? And in fact, Nick, in this book, Peter's really having a very hard time trying to decide what his life's path is going to be.
So in this book, Peter goes to, Mike, can you guys hear me? Peter goes to Iceland in search of a young boy whose American mother has been murdered, and the Icelandic father is the main suspect. And in Iceland, he's got to face the Icelandic father's fairly crazy family, and the head of the Icelandic police, and the weather. This is also the largest winter storm in 25 years. So he's got his hands full on this one.
Did I mention this is Nick Petrie over here? Probably. And this is Andrew Grant, whom I briefly mentioned. Right, but well, there's several things we can talk about the wild one. But one is, I thought it was interesting that the idea you said came to you in the Reykjavik airport, sort of like a vision from St. Paul, right? Except you're Peter.
Well, so I am not someone who comes up with a big idea and writes an outline and develops that way. So I generally am right by the seat of my pants. I start with something small and it builds into something else. And this book, I went to Iceland to go backpacking with my son, and we had this kind of a transcendent experience. And in the airport on the way back, this book sort of appeared in my head I had about 20 minutes where I had the whole book in my head, which had never happened before, and I hope it never happens again. I carry a little notebook, and I scribbled frantically, until it sort of disappeared, and I spent the next year and a half sort of trying to sort of reassemble and kind of conjure up that vision again, which is a very strange way to write a book.
Well, it worked for the New Testament, but apparently not for a thriller.
I'll take that comparison.
All right, so Andrew, do you have like these moments of blinding inspiration, or are you more of a craftsman?
Well, I think I did have inspiration once, which isn't too bad in 13 years. It was for False Positive, which is the series I wrote about the police detective in Birmingham, Alabama. I'd changed publishing houses, and my editor had asked me to think of something new to write. So I was desperately trying to come up with a good idea, and I had nothing. I went to bed one night, nothing at all, and when I woke up the next morning, I had a dream. I know this sounds horribly hokey, but I woke up the next morning, and it wasn't the whole book. It wasn't the whole book, but it was the key thing in the book, the key thing about the character. I woke up and I thought, right, that's the secret. That's the thing that's going to hold this book together.
So you were able to build. What did you write? 2 or 3 books about him?
Yeah, 3.
Wasn't it? Yeah. And now Paul McGrath. Where did he come from? Because this is book 2 of 2 books about Paul so far.
Yeah, Paul was a long time coming. He was somebody that I had in the back of my mind for many, many years. And I think sort of inspiration came from different places and kind of gelled together. One of them comes from a book I read years and years ago when I was a teenager called The Castle by Franz Kafka. It's a very weird, surreal book in which there is a castle, and lots of people work in this castle, but no one knows what's going on because no one will talk to one another, except the only person that actually does know what's happening is the barber, the hairdresser, because everybody comes to get their haircut, and while they're getting their haircut, they tell him what they're doing. So he is actually the only person that understands what is going on in this whole society. And I remember thinking about that when I was younger, and I thought, this is fantastic. Think about the power that you have. And not because knowledge is power. If you're the only one that has all that knowledge, and so for a while I had this idea. Remember those old movies or TV shows where you'd see an office, and in the office there'd be someone that ran around with a tea trolley, serving drinks and whatever. My life goal was actually to be the guy that wheeled the tea trolley around, because I thought, forget about being the CEO or whatever, those guys know nothing. What I want is to be the guy that actually knows, and the only way to do that is to be the tea guy. But then unfortunately technology moved on, tea guys all got fired, so I was forced to find something else to do for a living.
I'm trying to remember if it was Agatha Christie or what, but I mean, part of the plot was that nobody could figure out who was the murderer, and then so the question came down to who was the most invisible person in the village, and it turned out to be the postman, because everybody was used to seeing the postman, so he didn't stand out. So Peter Ash, you know, he's under the radar, especially in your book where you send him to Memphis to figure things out for that woman when her house collapsed and all the rest of it.
Well, I've never really had a job myself. I made it through college. I got a degree in creative writing and American culture, which is sort of like, and then I became a roofer's helper, which is what one does with that degree. And so I never owned a suit. I was a roofer's helper, and then I was a carpenter's helper, which is a big step up. Let me tell you. And then I started a renovation business, and then I became a building inspector. So I always worked out of my house, and I always worked for myself. And so I have no idea how to write a character inside an organization because I have never lived in an organization. So, you know, in part that's why Peter is the way he is, because I could never write a police procedural because I can't do an office. I've never lived that life. The amount of research would be just painful. I'd have to get a job.
I could see that discipline would be your enemy. And no wonder you're a pantser, even a printed page. So I would like you to talk to each other about why you've decided to have ex-military guys as Peter and Paul, because they could have come from any environment, really, except the corporate world.
Well, it's sort of in the air, right? And in part, I mean, there's a, you know, we've had this long-running war, and so if you think about crime fiction and I mean fiction in general from the Vietnam War era, there are a lot of Vietnam vets. You know, David Morrell's character Rambo, you know, is sort of one of the classic thriller characters at that time. But you know, I think we're living in that time, and we have, you know, Tom Clancy was sort of on the wane, and you know, our current conflicts, you know, kind of I think is we're living in a time when you know, camouflage pattern is fashion, right? I mean, it is the air we breathe, and so I think it's just, you know, we're seeing a lot more of it. You know, I started thinking about this character, you know, 10 years ago when I was a building inspector and my clients were all coming back from the surge, and I was looking at these folks and looking at their lives and thinking about what they'd done overseas and trying to, you know, feeling very sympathetic of the challenges they were having coming back. So that's kind of where it comes from for me. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think, you know, I can absolutely see that in this current day and age. But for me, I think it almost goes. It's something I can never really remember not thinking about, because, you know, one of the old cliches is that you write what you know. Becomes a little bit more difficult to then pin down, well, what does that mean? What do you know? And my father was ex-military, and really, even though you're only in the military for a certain period of time, it defines the rest of your life.
It does.
You know, everything about the rest of his life was defined by the time he spent in the army, and that goes to how he spoke. You know, how he thought, how he organised things, even to the end of his days. If we were going, and obviously the UK is a lot smaller, so you know the map reading challenges are maybe a little less extreme. But if we were going to go on a long car journey, he would sit down the day before, he would plan the route, and he would memorise the route, because you don't know what's going to happen to you on the journey. You might not have your map. So it's no good thinking, okay, well, I'll turn to page 74, because who knows what's happened to page 74. You know, right to the end of his days, everything he did was determined by the experience he had, you know, between sort of 18 and 22. So that permeated into me, even though, you know, I was a very late addition to the family. I grew up with that lingo and with that mindset. And I think the other thing about it, which becomes very appealing as a character, it certainly comes through in Peter, I hope it does in Paul too. You know, the main part of the service ethos is service.
Right.
You know, the character, you know, if you read about a character that does all these things because he wants to get rich, you know, that's not very attractive. You know, if you do it because he wants to get even, you know, that has got limited appeal. But if you have a character who devotes his life, who takes chances, who risks everything to do what is right, I think that is something that really strikes a chord with everyone.
That's a hero, right? I mean, that's yeah. We were talking about this earlier. The idea of this character, I think that the janitor, Paul McGrath, there's something so elemental about sort of this character and what he's doing. It's not a complicated idea, but it's a big idea. And I'm totally jealous. I really wish I could come up with it myself.
So my sort of boring thought that maybe it's because if they'd been in the military, these guys had a skill set that, like the average corporate bookkeeper would lack, and physical skill set where they could like dangle people off roofs or threaten to, or some of the things. In other words, they can be action guys and be believable because they have been trained to do that. Was that ever part of it?
Well, sure. I mean, it was for me.
But you didn't mention it. That's why.
Well, but I don't know. I think I don't know if this is how you work, but for me, stuff sort of shows up in my head, right? I was joking with Tasha earlier. She said she'd recently read, I don't know, a half dozen books about the Lindbergh baby and why had that been interesting to her. And I said, because it's going to show up in a book of yours, 5 years from now. And to me, that's how my brain works. Is there something I've read that will just sort of roam around up there and show up as something else. And so I didn't say, now let's see, what are the characteristics of a guy, because I want to write these kind of books. I was writing about a guy who was kind of lost, and that the military background was a way to make him really lost, and to really be sort of damaged.
Yeah, well, for me, I think that as you say, Barbara, having your character have a military background is very, very useful when it comes to the skill set. And when I wrote my first series, again, did 3 books in that series, and I was maybe a little bit more cautious and a little bit more tentative when I was approaching those books, and I was more worried about making sure that every I was dotted and T was crossed. And so, but ahead of time, I did think about how do I justify where he can go in the world, and I came up with the idea for that, and how do I justify what skill set he'll have, so that people aren't asking, well, how does he know how to do these things? So I did think about that ahead of time. But then I had an experience when I wrote a standalone, where the guy was absolutely deliberately not a veteran, not a professional, just a guy. He was very skilled in his own field, but absolutely clueless when it came to military or martial arts things. And what I found, to my great surprise, was that I really, really enjoyed writing that book. I really enjoyed it because I would have scenarios where, I remember one scene I was writing it where the hero gets trapped in the back room in a supermarket, and there were 3 guys outside pinning him in. And I remember thinking, well, if this had been my first series, it would have been what? Only 3 guys? It would have been a 2-sentence scene, Whereas because this guy had no professional grounding whatsoever in how to escape from a room when there are 3 guys outside, it was much more of a challenge to write. And I think that can come over in the reading. And so that kind of almost sort of cured me of that concern. So I think it's a convenient, it's certainly something that's very useful when you're writing a character with those skills, but it's no longer for me such a kind of pivotal thing.
I'm not sure that moral force alone can carry a hero through an action thriller. I think you do have to have a balance there.
Well, no, but so if you think about, like Joe Finder comes to mind, right?
Right.
So he writes these sort of kind of average, he used to do sort of corporate thrillers, and now he does these sort of average guy books, right?
And we're back to the PI guy. He'll be here
okay.
a week from
Oh
Saturday.
yeah, I haven't seen
with
his
Nick
new one.
Heller again.
Oh, good.
And he's going to teach a writing workshop for any of you who might be interested. The fee includes a copy of his book, but whether you're a writer or a reader and you're interested in how writers work, it'll be fun to have him do that.
Well, and he's a super nice guy. He's a really neat guy. But so to writing sort of the everyday person, that you can ratchet up the tension so much more because they don't know the way out. They don't see the way out. And one of the fun things about writing The Wild One is there is there's this separate sections that go through where we're seeing. It's my first kind of really sort of regular guy bits that I've done, and it was so much fun to do, and it was so interesting the way that you could play with the tension and the way you could really sort of twist the knife, not to, be too crude about it, but you can really, you can mess with those characters in a different way, which is interesting.
Well, one of the reasons I brought up the ex-military is that, which guy we have here, Peter, is suffering from a serious case of PTSD. And for the first thing that's hard for him is to get on an airplane and sit there in a confined space to go to Iceland to do this job that he's going to do. He has to drug himself, right?
Right.
So part of the deal in this book is, will he survive the PT, or will he be able to find some way to cope with it? And then furthermore, what's he going to do with his life? Because he isn't going to have a regular job, and he can't really work inside. So what's going to happen to him? You've got it's not a coming of age book, but it's an interesting book. And then
It's kind of a come to Jesus book. Yeah.
Oh God, we're back to the New Testament. I should have known better. But no, I mean, I think he's on a real journey in two cases. He's on a personal journey in this book, and then he's on the mission, as I said.
Right. Well, to me, that's one of the things that I didn't think about when I started the series, but talking to readers who are veterans about kind of their experience, it's become really important to me to sort of show that journey, right? That, I mean, I know people who were in Vietnam and have post-traumatic stress and have had it for 50 plus years, and it is still with them every day. And to sort of have a conversation through stories with those people, it's a really interesting kind of conversation, and I do feel a certain sort of obligation to sort of show Peter living through those moments that some of those readers have lived through. I mean, I don't take their stories and put them on the page, but it's those kinds of moments that people have, and I think that's part of what makes it powerful.
So Andrew, your guy doesn't have PTSD, but he has as a family history that is really dogging him. And so one of the questions is, how's he going to resolve that as we're moving along?
Yeah, no, that's something, again, as Nick was saying, it wasn't something that really, when I was originally thinking about this series and was starting the first book, that I thought was going to play such a major role. But then as I was writing the first book, I realized that there was this opportunity to do something with it. So I ended up with a kind of dual track where you have Paul is not only trying to, when his role as the janitor at the courthouse, when he comes across injustice, his moral compass is such that he is obliged to do something about it. But alongside that, he is trying to find out what happened to his father and trying to make sure that his father receives justice. And that leads him through a whole series of discoveries. And one of the ones that comes up in the second book, I'm kind of happy with, I'm pleased with, and then that is in turn going to lead to more discoveries about his family in the third one, which I'm working on at the moment.
I have to say that having dinner with you last night, I was really pissed off to discover that you set that all up in the first book, and I totally missed it. I wasn't the only one, was I, Tasha?
When I was reading that manuscript, I gasped out loud and almost fell off the couch when I got to that part. I really did.
But didn't you think, how did I miss that in the
I
first
totally
book? Of course
missed
you
it.
did. I know, so
Totally
did I.
missed it.
Yeah, because
He's sneaky.
one of the problems of writing a thriller is that you know what's happening. You know. So it's very hard to gauge when you put in clues and signposts. Are they clear enough? Are they too clear? Is it too obvious?
Right.
And if there's something that you're putting in because you know that it's going to lead to something else, you know that it's there and it's shining at you like it's neon, and you're worried that everyone is going to look at that and say, wait a minute, what about? And then, the cat's out of the bag too soon. So I'm very happy that the cat stayed in the bag through the first one and then came out at the right time in the second one.
Well, and that's the goal, right? Is to have it be inevitable in retrospect, right? You get to the end and say, "Oh my God, why didn't I see it? It was there the whole time." I mean, that's the perfect.
Actually, I think he did it so well. I'd like to think that I'm a good reader. Surely I was. He fooled his wife and his bookseller. I mean, come on, right? No, I thought he did a truly masterful job. There is a twist in this book that will truly blindside you. I mean, certainly blindsided me, and that doesn't happen very often. And Nick actually has a wonderful character in his book. Well, you told him he's an Irishman. He's not a sidekick. We're not sure what he is he? He could be a sidekick. He could be an adversary.
His name is Seamus Haney, after the Irish poet. He came about because my son and I, who's kind of my adventure, backpacking partner, will occasionally break into our terrible Irish accents as we hike along. And so it started out as kind of a joke to throw into my son, and then of course the character, has, he's got a certain amount of charm. There's a certain amount of, there's something going on that you can't, kind of what's he doing? And it was fun to do, and that's the thing about, instead of being an outliner or someone who plans in advance, the thing about writing by the seat of your pants is people sort of show up and they just sort of they kind of take over little pieces of real estate, and it's a really interesting process that way.
Happened to you?
Yeah, that's definitely happened to me. I mean, I've never, we were talking about this earlier, I've never really had a sidekick character before, but in this series it turns out that Paul does have someone. It's a guy who was a very distant colleague. He kind of crossed paths in the military, but they reconnected, and now they work together. And I hadn't planned that. It came along that there was a sort of plot-based reason for needing somebody, and then once that person appeared, I just thought, wow, I really like this. I really enjoy this. But actually, maybe a better example might be in the Cooper Devereux books. It turns out Cooper has a daughter, and that she sort of occurred to me, and I think if you're very fortunate, you get nice messages from people sometimes, and the messages I've received about that daughter, the way that she ends the first book in that series, that's one of the things I really feel good about.
So when we say that Paul's a janitor, isn't that he did any sort of professional training. He's a janitor because he wants to get into the courthouse and find a missing file in the first book, and he determines that his best shot is to be an anonymous employee. But then he discovers that cloak of anonymity allows him to do, it reminds me a little bit of Person of Interest, which is a program I absolutely love, where a person will come along to whom you have no connection, but they're in trouble, and you have the skill set to help and the resources to help them out. So you have a series of missions, and that's really, while Paul is working on his own personal mission, he's also, helping kind of random people that he finds in the courthouse.
Yeah, well, Nick mentioned the idea of a hero. What is a hero? And I guess you have the concept of noblesse oblige. If you can, you should. And I think that is a major element of a heroic character. And similar things show with the adventures that Peter gets himself dragged into.
Well, there's also this piece that in sort of modern life where it's all about irony and being cynical. It's hard to there are certain sections of the population where the idea of honor and duty are not taken very seriously, but there's a big chunk of this country where how you behave towards your neighbors and how you behave toward the people you work with. For me, it was how I behaved with my clients who really had placed so much trust in what I did, and there's a lot of money at stake. That's serious, and it's not a. I think it's easy to sort of think, well, this is sort of a trope in crime fiction, but it's a. I think that's a very. It's sort of the glue that holds our society together, and it's an interesting thing to talk about in fiction and to show in fiction as well.
Yeah, I think this is sort of the Private Eye novel used to be where this happened.
Right.
This used to be like Ross MacDonald was writing Lou Archer and Travis McGee and whatever. And the Private Eye is kind of an endangered species today because you can't, thanks to technology and all, most private eyes are sitting at their computer, so they're not action heroes. So there's Jeff Parker is writing
Right.
a veteran. You guys are writing veterans.
Those are great books.
Reacher, see, I blame your brother for most of this, but Reacher is an ex-military. The book Thursday night, we have a new author coming on Thursday, and another ex-military, another person on a mission, but it's a woman, and she's absolutely fabulous. It's a book called Deep State by Chris Howdy,
Oh yeah.
which I really like. And so we're, this is not gender specific at this
Right,
point.
right.
You can have, a woman who has been in the military and has much of these same.
Yeah, that book's gotten a lot of buzz.
It's very good. It's a great voice. I read for voice. See, I don't really care that much what happens in the book. I only care that I really like the voice. Well, you know what? There are plot holes, and it just happens. And I do think that Deep State has a somewhat. You have to sort of take a little leap of faith in part of it, but I don't really care because I like the way he talks. He's a screenwriter, so he's obviously had plenty of practice. But what I liked was that this is a new character who's doing essentially what you guys are doing, but she's different.
Right.
But again, there's a mission. So it used to be that the private eye had a contract with a client, and the private eye, unlike the police, could do things for a client because he wasn't constrained or she wasn't constrained by. Remember the '90s when all the private eyes were female? Was that woman's sort of thing? But now that's what you guys are doing. Who is Peter loyal to? Who is Paul loyal to in these two books?
Well, Peter has a client too. I mean, that's how I think about
Right.
sort of who is Peter trying to help.
Right.
And it's a useful way for me to sort of think about the book. So I've got to find that person, and that's how I start.
But where is his ultimate loyalty? I mean, if he has to make choices in the book, who is he going to be the most loyal to?
Go to whoever is the most vulnerable. I mean, I guess I've never asked myself that question. That's a very interesting
That's
question.
why you're here.
Take it to school, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, I guess for me, the way I see Paul is, it's almost, it goes above and beyond the details of the stories. Paul is loyal to us. Paul, my idea of Paul is that he's the hero for the 21st century. He's the hero for when the disparity in income is greater than it's ever been. He's the hero for, the times when, 0.001% of the country own more than the rest of the country combined. He's the hero that will stand up for you or me when we are at our most vulnerable and our most desperate. So I guess that what I'm aiming to do, as well as make it believable as a set of characters, they are also characters that represent things. There are people, there are villains in these books. The stuff they do is based, in principle, exactly on things that people are doing right now in the country today that are, horrendously destructive, incredibly immoral. What I like to play with, though, is the idea of the difference between what is moral and what is legal. Because the way the deck is stacked right now, there are people out there that can do stuff that is completely immoral, utterly disgusting and disgraceful, but is legal. So, if you are, say you're a guy who's at the end of his tether, you've worked hard, you've been honest, you've tried to support your family your whole life, and someone destroys all of that legally, and you are pushed to the end of your tether, and you do something like you burn his house down.
For example.
Yeah.
As you do.
What should happen to you? You didn't do it at random. You didn't just do it for fun. You did it because your life had been destroyed by someone, because perhaps they wanted some additional bottles of wine, or they wanted another house of their own, or they wanted another yacht. So yeah, I think that if it's not too much of a stretch, my view is that Paul is there for us. It's not necessarily any particular character in the book.
I'm not sure too many of us, though, would lure a guy up to the top of the roof, on the roof of a large building and then walk into the edge.
I can think of a dozen people I'd like to do.
Well, but that's something I could do. It's something Peter could do. It's not something that I could do very credibly, because I'm the one who'd probably go over the edge, in a situation like that.
But I think it's, Paul, as I say in the book, Paul's not a savage. He did rope off a little section of sidewalk,
I
so
love that part.
if it was necessary to throw the guy off, he's not going to catch any other.
Right. Nobody else is going to get hurt in the
That's
process.
right. No innocent bystanders will be killed in the descent, right?
Yeah.
Actually, you walk around New York every day and risk that happening to you.
Yeah.
Tree limbs fall and pieces fall off buildings and innocent people are killed, but still,
Yeah.
it was a pretty dramatic opener.
Yeah, I had real fun with that, and again, in a way, because I have a thing in the first two books where there's a sort of action sequence that opens the book, and I kind of envisaged. Do you remember the old James Bond movies, particularly from the 70s and 80s, where there was always a crazy action scene at the beginning? You know, somebody skiing off a cliff, or
That wasn't related to the story that came after.
it wasn't. Whereas I do try to relate it to the story, but I do like there to be something, you know, big and eye-catching
It's
at the
nice to
beginning.
start with a bang. Yeah.
Well, you certainly did. I'm never going to recover from your second book. I think that's one of the truly best. Burning Bright has one of the greatest opening action scenes ever. I'm waiting for Daniel Craig.
That would be great. I'd sign him up.
You'd be okay with that?
Yeah, I would.
So tell us a little bit about those damn Vikings, because I really enjoyed them.
Well, so you mean the characters in the book, or Iceland in general?
No,
No.
the ones in the
So let's see. So we have we have Bjarni, who is a cousin of the father of the boy, who is dealing drugs in a nightclub in Iceland. We have the uncles, who are also known as the enormous uncles, who are smugglers and just generally sort of a little rough around the edges, let's just say. So this is a whole family that is engaged in this generations-long sort of Icelandic underworld. And it was fun to kind of imagine how that would work and how it would manifest. And Iceland, actually, I thought about you and Tasha with this book because the breakthrough with figuring out how to write these Icelandic characters, because I was all caught up in the language and the idioms and like what, they have to be so different because they're, Icelandic and the language is so weird. And but then somebody said, Iceland is like the Wyoming of Europe. And I just thought, because they don't recycle and everybody has monster trucks, and I mean it's a really interesting concept. And I thought about all of the people that I knew and who sort of gravitated to the end of the road, and that we had talked about sort of that being one of the appeals of where you live in Wyoming. And I've been all over the West, and I know lots of people who have washed up on the end of the road, and so that was kind of where that came from. But Iceland itself was fascinating. It's the size of the state of Maine, which has about 5 million people, and we don't think of Maine as being a very densely populated state. So Maine has 5 million people. Iceland, same size, has 330,000 people, and 2/3 of those people are in Reykjavik, the capital, in one little corner of the country. So it is a vast and empty place, and it was settled 1,200 years ago. It was the poorest place in Europe for 1,150 of those years, and it's this, and just the landscape. It is like walking through some Norse epic out of time. It's just an amazing place.
And fine. So
Yes,
you'll be able to
yes,
go there
there's-
soon. On a regular, actually, you can now go around Greenland. We were talking about that. I've been halfway up Greenland and around the bottom several times, but now there's an actual cruise coming up where you
Go
can
all the way
circumnavigate Greenland, which, Lord, how did that happen? So Iceland, I think, is going to be becoming, especially if you live in Phoenix, a destination for the summer. If Alaska's too crowded.
Yeah.
And it's a great place. Also, Icelandic Air has a really neat deal. If you fly, they will stop in Iceland and you can stay as long as you want and then go on to your destination, which most airlines won't let you do. So it's very cool.
Yeah.
Tasha, you did that,
I
didn't you?
did.
So you
I
can,
highly recommend it. It's
Yeah.
a beautiful place.
so I can see why you enjoyed it. But Peter is not going to relocate to Iceland, right?
Oh no. Peter, I think Iceland. I was taking a big swing. I was trying to sort of get deeper into his head and to treat him more poorly than I ever had before. And I guess I had to go somewhere else. All the other books are set in the U.S. What I'm working on now is set in the U.S. So I think part of it was just I had to take him to someplace very different in order to
And leave June behind.
leave June behind.
Yeah. That's hard.
Yeah.
Right. So you're living in Wyoming and writing about Manhattan. Isn't that a little weird?
It is. But I mean, New York is such a strange place to use as a setting because, there's a way in which, New York is everywhere and New York is also nowhere. It's its own thing. And for many years, my goal was to leave the UK and move to New York. So, I visited it as often as possible. I went there whenever I could. I explored it as much as possible. the only thing that went a little bit awry was that I did leave the UK and I did move to the United States. Only by this point I'd met Tasha, so
Hey, to New York,
yeah,
right?
New York was out of the window. Chicago was where we were initially, and thing with writing is you're in your head. You're thinking about and inhabiting an environment that you're very much imagining. And so I hope that I've spent enough time in New York to be able to recreate the location and the feeling and the vibe and the sense of it. Plus, I've been to do some specific research there. Paul works in the courthouse, so I've been and I've poked around and nosed around in the courthouse and discovered all the various different places that are there. For example, in the first book, I had a little scene that was set in the nuclear fallout shelter that is beneath the courthouse, which a lot of people don't know is there. So it's fun. You've got the micro level location, and then you've got the broader. So there's plenty of opportunity really to cover those, I think.
Yeah, sounds great. Question?
I have a question. First of all, Andrew, I've never heard of you before. This is my first time at the bookstore.
Wow.
But I like it. And this lady's fascinating. She's a really good MC type person. And I like your jacket and I like your accent, so I'm going to have to get your book.
There you go.
A commercial break, right?
Why, what a good idea.
But I have a question for Nick, actually, if I may.
Sure.
So I've read your books. My dad was Korean Vietnam, severe PTSD, severe claustrophobia. I have severe OCD. So I'm emotionally moved and connected to the character in your book. What's fascinating to me about what both you and Andrew have said is that there's a larger nobility to your message. And I think so many times authors don't really recognize their ability to actually change the world, to give hope, to give different perspective through the writings, which are very, very entertaining and commercial. My question with Peter, because he's so fascinating, is how much of your focus when you write is on storytelling versus also trying to give that message of hope, that there's an opportunity that people can fight through and be successful and have that heroic finality to what they're doing?
Well, I think the death of good fiction is a message. So I just want people to either identify with Peter or to be sympathetic to him, and I hope that his struggle will help other people with theirs. I think that somebody asked me the other day about post-traumatic stress and why I'm not in the military, I don't have PTSD, sort of why this is something that I've written about, and in part it's because, and I didn't really realize this until much later, but we all have issues like that to some various degree. There are all things that we're worried about. There are all things we can't let go of or can't get out of our heads. Whether it's politics or Australian wildfires or whatever it is that or the safety of your kids or my son went off to college. That really freaked me out. It's fine, but it freaked me out. But the thing about showing these things through stories, right? I mean, this is how we've been telling stories forever. We've been painting on cave walls. I mean, we tell stories to understand the universe, right? That's where early religion came from. All of that stuff, and so I don't think you have to have the message in mind, because the message is inherent in the story that you tell. And I guess I feel lucky that I sort of fell into this character and this kind of story that really speaks to people. So I'm glad it speaks to you. Thank you.
I think you made an important point, which I brought up the other day, but I'm going to say it again. We're in a very difficult year in a world that's really messed up, and all around us there are tensions and things. And we made a conscious decision that the bookstore was going to be a safe place where you guys could come down here, and the power of storytelling. To your point, sir, the power of storytelling is tremendous and helps us make sense out of the world. It allows us to escape, but it also allows us to think about things and maybe inspire us to be heroes. And you can sneer commercial fiction if you wish to, but I think it's very powerful. I think that there's a whole thing going on where many bookstores have become like political and, you know, centers of resistance of all different kinds and all. And we just decided not to do that, that we were gonna let the stories do their magic on all of you. Right, Patrick? Or is that my message and you're just sitting there? Didn't mean to blindside you, but I mean, we did have that conversation though, haven't we?
Yeah, we have.
And we don't necessarily agree. That's okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, Nick mentioned he's pretty much a pantser. I haven't really heard from Andrew yet. How do you go for there? But I'd also like to ask, at one point for the pantser, when do you risk starting to spew words? Do you get 50, 60,000 words down and go, oh crap, start over? How does it work for you, for each of you?
Why don't you start with what's your process here?
Okay, well, thank you for the question. It's an excellent question because, you know, if you've got 10 writers in the room and ask them that, you get 11 answers. And one thing I always go back to is an old cliche that says, you never learn how to write a book, you only ever learn how to write the one you just wrote. And so, of the ones I've written, the process hasn't necessarily been the same. I think that each book has different demands depending on the kind of story you're telling and the complexity of the structure. So the Devereux books that I wrote, I had a conscious decision with those books that for each one I wanted to have 3 separate strands of the story, and I wanted them to intertwine, obviously building up to a point where they all came together for the conclusion. But during the bulk of the book, I decided, I mean, this is just a sort of random idea that I had at the beginning. There was it wasn't necessarily the right thing to do. But I wanted there to be these 3 strands, and I wanted it to be that there was never a time when you had consecutive chapters with the same strand of the story. So, you know, you had the sense that each one was progressing at a similar speed. And so for those books, I really had to think about that pretty carefully, because I had to think of 3 stories, and I had to kind of parcel them up in a way that made them kind of equivalent so that they would all move along at the same speed. So those books I really thought about quite carefully. But then with other books, it has been much more a question of deciding, you know, you do a certain amount of thinking and planning ahead of time. It's as if you're kind of filling a tank with ideas. And then when you feel like there are enough ideas in that tank, you open the faucet, they come out, and you hope that there's enough to fill the entire novel. And then you don't need to worry so much about how much you're structuring and planning. So the janitor books, there are certain things that I've had to be very careful about because each one has involved a particular kind of crime, which are technically challenging. The current book involves the shorting of stock, you know, which is a totally bizarre thing. You know, it makes really very little sense. In no rational world would you be able to short stock. You know, it's only that we live in a world where, you know, you have to have all kinds of mechanisms so that if you've already got loads and loads of money, that, you know, there's a way that you can get even more. So I had to find out, how did that work? And when you first start to read about it, you think, wait a minute, this can't be right. And so you have to find a way that you can drip feed that information such that it's understandable and it doesn't all deluge on you like you're reading a finance textbook. So there's a certain amount of thought that goes into that, but if the structure of the book isn't as critical, then for me anyway, I feel more confident in letting the story go and just following it through to the conclusion.
Well, you know, similarly, if there will be a point in the book where I'll say, boy, I need to figure out how to tweak the structure, right? So like this book I wrote 70,000 pages, and I before I really realized I needed to go back and layer in this whole other strand of story. So then I spent 3 weeks and I wrote, I don't know how many I wrote the first 6 or 7 sections of that, kind of all in one. And then I thought, okay, now this one's going to go here, and that one's going to go there, and that one's going to go there. You know, so it really does go back and forth between, it does sort of come out, but then there are points where you have to sort of stop and say, now wait a minute, and reassess and make some choices. And I've never hit 60,000 words and thrown it out. But I had a book. I told my editor I was going to write a book set in Detroit, and I wrote the same 10,000 words over and over and over, and it was just clear that book was not coming out. So luckily I had met a guy in the Phoenix airport who was on his way to Portland, Oregon, to start a cannabis grow. And I had a very long conversation with him, and then that's the book I started, was the book that became Light It Up, which is, you know, about the cannabis industry in Colorado. So it's a, you know, it's to say that I'm a pantser is I mean, it's true, but I think most people have some variation on their outliners until they become pantsers, until the outline becomes irrelevant or wrong. Or they're pantsers until they realize it's time to do a little planning. Otherwise the book's going to be, you know, a mess. You know, and it is this sort of back and forth between, you know, sort of trying to, you know, between inspiration and analysis, and if that's maybe another way to think about it. Does that answer your question?
I think an interesting question is, you know, does the book always start where you think it's going to? I mean, does the end at the end, does the book start where you thought it would, or did you? Because I think there are a lot of false starts to books.
Yeah, you know, that's to me one of the great things about starting with a bang, starting with a scene of excitement, is because it forces you to start in the middle. And then sometimes I'll throw stuff out, or I'll pare it down, or I'll need to throw something in ahead. But to me, I do like that idea of starting. You know, it's a famous Elmore Leonard. One of his 10 rules for writing is I think this is an Elmore Leonard, is to start in the middle.
I can't remember. I'm always hung up and I leave out the words that readers skip, which is my personal favorite Elmore Leonard. But he might have said that. Yeah, he did. But I mean, you know, when you start a series, you know, you had to settle upon Paul and Peter somewhere in their life, right?
Right.
I mean, so does the urge to then? I mean, I find that most long series wind up having a prequel, because there's so much to explore before whatever arbitrary point, you know, that you started. You're too shortly into it. I mean, 2 books and, you know, 4 books is not, or is it 5?
This one's 5, yeah.
5, right. It's not probably enough to. I think you turned it off by accident, or the battery ran out. You want to trade with me? Because it doesn't matter what I say here.
Right. I just hit the button wrong.
Yeah, but you know, there does seem to be. We have an author coming in February, Charles Venturi's Victorian fiction, and he wrote a prequel, and then that was so interesting. He wrote another prequel, and now he's coming with a 3rd prequel. So it's a prequel trilogy, and it's
a prequel sequel.
It is, but you know, it's really interesting because some of the things that happen in the main series haven't happened yet. And it's interesting to see them in their kind of developing stages, you know. So it rounds out the other books in an interesting way.
Well, I don't think about it on a book level, but the thing I'm thinking about a lot now is now that I'm 5 books in and I'm writing the 6th book in the series is you know, what does it mean to write a long running series? You know, I'm thinking about the long running series that I've loved and kind of the choices they've made. You know, C.J. Box, whose characters age in real time, right?
And this is book 20 coming up on March 2nd.
Right. And Sue Grafton, who, you know, the books are basically set a month apart, all in 1984 and 1985, or whenever those years are. And you make some decisions, and you're sort of glued in. And you have to live with those decisions. And I think that's the appeal of the prequel, is you get to sort of throw it all out the window.
Particularly with the aging thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, you don't have to age everybody in real time. It's fiction.
Right. Well, no, but so he's made a very deliberate choice, because the kids are growing and the marriage evolves, and it's
but his time frame is not always. You're not always leaping like a year ahead.
right.
You know, that was Michael Connelly. That's what he did to himself with Harry. You know, I mean,
Right.
he started out that way. At some point, Harry had to retire because he got too old to actually work in LAPD.
But in a way, it kind of revived the series, right?
Debbie is retired.
Well, it has in the sense he's had to bring somebody else in, and Harry's moved from retired and then sort of like consultant, and now he's mentoring, you know, from the outside. So yeah, it has evolved it, but you're right. Once you make some decisions, you can't go back and make them totally different, but you can explain them.
And, you know, some of it is derived by the demands of the characters, because when I started to do the first one, Invisible, I knew that I was going to have this character who was the ex-military intelligence guy who was going to work at the courthouse. And initially, when I was thinking about how to tell the story, I was going to leap into the courthouse part much more quickly. But then I realized, as a reader, that's not going to be satisfying, because you have to follow the character's journey. You have to understand how the guy gets from point A. I thought it would be from point A to point B, but it turned out it had to be from point A to point X with a whole load of spots in between. And so once you realize that you need a larger amount of explanation to make it credible that he works from one spot to another spot, that kind of pushes you back. And that's one reason why I thought, we need to start with an episode that shows him in his old job, doing what he can do. It was really the most, I felt, satisfying way to get inside his head early, and then to understand the journey he was going to take.
Anybody else have a question you'd like to ask? Yes, ma'am.
Not a question, that's just I wanted to share odd irony. Our son gave us Nick's book when we were going to Iceland 2 years ago to read on the airplane, and we loved it so much we wanted book 2. So we bought book 2 in the Reykjavik airport.
Book 2 is the one with the really electric start, isn't it?
So,
I know, I loved it.
Now you've made this all full circle for us and written about Iceland, which we love that country.
It's a great place.
It's a really nice story. I love it.
Thank you.
It's very circular, isn't
Yeah.
it? Wow, who knew that going to Iceland was
Your
going
son
to
is
do-
Dan.
Hello.
He certainly is.
Oh.
I spent middle school afternoons hanging out at your house
I
listening
brought
to...
some pictures for you.
Oh.
You're gonna love them. You have hair.
Very nice.
Yes, I had hair back then.
Yeah.
Maybe at this moment, before we have too many more questions, it would be a nice idea to say goodbye to our video audience. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have people you'd like to share this evening with, you can go to our Facebook page.